Recently, I've been listening to the Undertale soundtrack a lot. It's pretty awesome if you've never heard it. It is largely but not strictly chiptune, and this intrigued me to look a little bit more into the genre as a whole, specifically in games, seeing how he literally used the same sounds from the NES, as well as the same sound fonts from countless titles on later consoles like the SNES and Game Boy Advance. The difference being, he was not limited by his DAW, as the composers for these original consoles very much were, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's begin looking at my track. The first thing I added was this melody with a square wave, which I think evokes an arcadey feel. The VST I'm using is called Nes VST. And was used by Toby when he was composing Undertale. It emulates the sounds from the NES's Soundchip, the ricoh 2A03. The 2A03 had 5 channels, 2 square waves for melody and accompaniment, both of which have 4 duty cycles, and they sound like this. Now, I won't get into duty cycles, but just know that they create a difference in timbre. Then we have a triangle wave, usually used for bass lines, and it sounds like this. Next, we have a noise channel, which sounds like this. We can use them like hi-hats by making them fast and choppy, as well as sound effects like this. The last channel intrigued me the most, as I'm sure it did Toby as well because of his extensive use of sound fonts, and that is the DPCM channel, which stands for Delta Pulse Code Modulation. So what's pulse code modulation? Well, in English, it's a sampler. More specifically, it's a way of turning an analog signal into a digital signal through sampling. In the case of the NES, audio recordings can have a bit depth of up to 7. Bit depth determines the auditory resolution and dynamics of the sample, and a sample rate of around 33,000 Hz, meaning it's taking a sample 33,000 times per second, samples being these little dots that are found if you zoom in on a waveform. Here's an approximation of what that sounds like with dialogue.
That's right. That's right.
Well, that's pretty good. Really good, actually. And believe it or not, the NES is actually capable of outputting sound at this high of quality, by utilizing the CPU in tandem with the sound chip. But this was almost never put in practice because it would only work in the case that the CPU is not busy doing other things, like loading graphics and CPUing. The audio recordings heard on NES games are low quality only partly due to computing power and technical limitations, but also to conserve space on the cartridge. And in the name of conserving space, that's where the D in our DPCM comes in. Delta is referring to a type of compression called delta encoding. Instead of measuring the current sample and the next sample, it simply measures the difference between them, with a strict rule of either 1 bit up or 1 bit down, no compromises. Therefore compressing each sample to a 1-bit value, saving an immense amount of space, and also significantly degrading the audio, adding those high-pitched overtones that we're used to. Here's an approximation of what that sounds like.
That's right. That's right.
That's a little more familiar. The DPCM channel was usually used for drums, sound effects, and in very rare cases, sampled instruments, or anything that isn't a square wave, triangle wave, or noise, pretty much. Speaking of the DPCM channel, the second thing I added was this kick and snare, the preset drums from NES VST. To work as hi-hats, I copied the main melody to the static channel and made the notes short. This resulted in a pretty cool percussion loop that shares the same rhythmic beats as my melody. After that, I added a bass line using the triangle wave. I like that a lot. After creating a nice foundation to work off of, I busted out another square wave and used it as a lead. Now, already, this wouldn't have been possible on the NES's Soundchip. I, 1, have 3 square waves playing at the same time at some points, over our limit of 2. I also have 2 drum samples being triggered at the same time, simply not possible on the NES. Not to mention the ease in which I'm able to compose. The tools I have are helping me move. not slowing me down and limiting me. If I want to write or record something in, FL Studio gives me this great interface that tells me what notes are being played at any given time via piano roll, with beat and bar lines to visually represent rhythm. The original composers didn't have this privilege. They had to compose music in one of the most tedious ways I can imagine, with a tracker. A tracker is essentially a very rudimentary DAW, specifically made for composing video games. They look like this. Not very intuitive. We can see our channels right up here, with rows and columns. The input of this first column represents the note being played. The second column is our instrument number. Third column is volume, and our last is effects, like tremolo and vibrato. Now, the up and down of it is just a sequencer, as if I took my FL Studio sequencer and flipped it vertically, and so you get this. I am definitely not ready to tackle a tracker yet, but maybe in the future I'll do a video on it. Let's get back to my track. I then started working on a B section, eventually deciding on this sound. Later layering it with a square wave. By the way, does it sound familiar at all? It's the same sound font from one of Undertale's most beloved tracks, Fallen Down, which is just like such a nice little melancholic piece that... Wait, what's a sound font? A sound font is simply a sampled instrument that can be triggered by MIDI. MIDI in this case is referring to any digital notation system. MIDI doesn't hold any audio information. It just tells the sound font which notes to play and for how long. The sound font holds all the data for what the notes actually sound like. Pretty much the exact same system being used today in VSTs, though sound font is a trademark type of file, needing a sound font player to play them. But the term sound font kinda refers to the concept at large. The sound font from Fallen Down is called Mellow Piano and is ripped from the game Earthbound, which came out for the SNES in 1994. Quite the upgrade from the simple synths of the NES. The SNES introduced full stereo sound, completely controllable volume and panning, as well as a reverb-like effect. It's like taking the DPCM channel from our NES chip, multiplying it by 8, and injecting it with trembolone. But just because of all of that, as well as it using half-decent sampled instruments now, doesn't mean there weren't still limitations that came with it. On the SNES, there was still a limit of 8 channels. Not bad, but with only half a megabyte of RAM, if you had multiple channels playing at once, you'd have to significantly lower your sample's quality to conserve the limited RAM. Now, back to my track. I added this arpeggio with the triangle wave to complement our B section's melody. As well as this saw wave that I found in the Earthbound sound font library, to kind of work as a bass while the triangle is, preoccupied. This same saw wave is found in Undertale's track Stronger Monsters, according to this spreadsheet. For our third and final section, I copy and pasted our original square wave melody, goofed it up a little bit, and expanded upon it to work as a build-up, as well as this ascending scale with the string 1 sound font from Mother 3. Last and certainly not least, I added this overdrive guitar from the Earthbound sound font library, with some added stereo width and distortion. Hopefully you recognize this one. Know where it's from? Arguably the most famous sound font in existence, at least by pure numbers. Also, I added stereo width before finding out Toby Fox actually did the exact same thing, so that's kinda cool, I guess. And with that, I mark the end of my track, but not the end of this video. If you want to listen to my track, it's gonna play during the end of the video. You know what they say, limitation breeds creativity. The limitations of the NES, SNES, and other old consoles' music has defined the genre of chiptune. Even though we have better quality now and limitless options, it doesn't mean we should just throw out all the old stuff. Just because we invented synths doesn't mean the orchestra became obsolete. The same can be said about chiptune music. Just because we have insanely high quality virtual instruments that sound indistinguishable from the real thing, doesn't mean there still isn't value in these not so high quality sounds. High quality doesn't even mean anything, really. 24-bit, 44,000 Hz audio isn't inherently better than delta encoded recordings. Is the auditory resolution higher? Absolutely. But who cares? Whatever sounds good, plain and simple. And I don't think chiptune music is going anywhere. Chiptune doesn't represent low quality. It's a full-on genre of music, where in the modern age, the options are limitless, though many like to stay completely within the limits for authenticity. But to me, the Undertale soundtrack really shows the possibility of chiptune without limitation, without the confines of 8 channels, without the confines of a tracker. Not to mention actually being able to properly mix your tracks with compression and sidechain and all that. The Undertale soundtrack honestly deserves an entire video dedicated to it, but the soundtrack is very significant to me. I don't think anybody thought that a little 8-bit style game like this in 2015 would sell how it did. Over 5 million copies, hundreds of millions of streams on Spotify, and hundreds of millions of views on YouTube. And call me crazy, but I think the soundtrack actually had an impact on this. In the year 2015, I was 10 years old, and Undertale would be the first game soundtrack that I ever listened to, and continued to listen to. In fact, I expressly remember before I even had any records, or a record player to speak of, I had the Undertale soundtrack vinyl on my Christmas list for a couple years. Do you know how insane it is to make a soundtrack so good that literal children want to buy it just to listen to it? The numbers speak for themselves. Toby Fox holds the record for the most streams of any video game song ever. I think what it was is I just never heard anything like it, besides Pokemon Fire Red, but that's a whole nother beast. He was often using old, recycled sounds, but breathed new life into them, introducing the current generation to an endless sea of soundtracks to go back and listen to. Speaking of, the song we're listening to right now is called Secret of the Forest from Chrono Trigger, which Toby used many sounds from, as well as just general inspiration, it seems to me. Admittedly, I've never listened to the soundtrack, but now I'm going to. There's truly more than meets the eye with video game music, and some people won't understand. And that's okay.